There are weeks in Genoa City when the truth arrives like a confession, and then there are weeks when the truth arrives like a weapon. The days ahead do not simply threaten to expose buried secrets. They threaten to turn old wounds into fresh battlegrounds, to force people who have been surviving on pride and denial into moments of brutal self-recognition. Everywhere, the warning signs are there. In the Abbott world, history refuses to stay dead. In the Newman orbit, power begins to look less like protection and more like poison. In distant cities where people tell themselves they are traveling for healing, temptation follows them anyway, quiet and patient, waiting for the exact moment. Loneliness weakens the last defense. And in Las Vegas, beneath the lights and noise and false glamour, danger is no longer abstract. It is physical, immediate, and pulsing through every bad decision made by men who are already losing control. By the time the week is over, nobody will be able to pretend that they were simply caught in unfortunate circumstances. These characters are moving toward disaster because of what they want, what they fear, and what they still refuse to admit about themselves. Jack finds himself standing at the center of one of those cruel emotional storms that only exist because a man once believed he could manage chaos without becoming part of it. The situation with Patty is no longer just an uncomfortable remnant of the past. It has become a living accusation, a reminder that Jack's instinct to protect, to contain, and to quietly shoulder a crisis has once again created a new kind of damage. His likely confession about the full Patty story is not merely an act of honesty. It is a surrender to the fact that secrecy has stopped serving anyone. Yet confession does not cleanse him. It exposes him. It leaves him vulnerable to the fury of the women who have every reason to believe he waited too long, trusted the wrong instincts, and underestimated how much destruction one unstable obsession could still cause. Jack's turmoil is not only about Patty's interference. It is about the terrifying realization that his attempt to keep order in the family has actually opened the door to a deeper collapse of trust. He wants to believe that telling the truth now will save what remains of his marriage and his moral authority. But men like Jack often discover too late that delayed honesty looks dangerously similar to betrayal. Diane feels that betrayal more sharply than anyone. What infuriates her is not simply Patty's presence, or the obvious insult of Patty circling her marriage like a predator from another era. It is the humiliation of being forced to defend what should never have been under attack to begin with. Diane has spent too much of her life fighting to be taken seriously, too much of it paying for past mistakes, too much of it trying to prove that love and stability were no longer fantasies she borrowed from other people's lives. Now Patty does not merely threaten her peace. Patty threatens Diane's hard-earned legitimacy. That is why Diane's anger is so dangerous. It is not theatrical anger. It is the anger of a woman who sees her place in the family, in the home, and in Jack's heart being tested by madness and memory at the same time. She cannot simply dismiss Patty, because Patty represents a nightmare that Diane understands all too well. In Genoa City, a person's past is always one twist away from becoming their future again. Diane's resentment toward Jack grows not because she doubts that he loves her, but because she suspects he still handles emotional emergencies like a man who believes women can be managed rather than fully trusted. That suspicion turns her pain into cold resolve. She becomes sharper, more watchful, less forgiving. If Patty intends to invade her marriage, Diane is no longer interested in just surviving that invasion. She wants to crush it, completely and without mercy. Patty, meanwhile, continues to operate from that unnerving place, where delusion and instinct blend so seamlessly that even her chaos seems strategic. She thrives in emotional fractures. She senses hesitation, old guilt, unspoken discomfort, and then drives herself directly into the weakest point. Her campaign against Diane is not only about Jack, it is about proving that the emotional order others have built is fragile, artificial, and ultimately reversible. Patty feeds on the possibility that somewhere underneath respectability and marriage vows, Jack still carries the emotional imprint of who they once were to one another, however distorted that history may be now. She does not need reality to agree with her. She only needs enough discomfort to destabilize everyone else. That is what makes her so dangerous this week. She is not simply stirring trouble because she enjoys it. She is turning herself into a test. If Jack hesitates, Diane suffers. If Diane lashes out, Patty gains proof that the marriage is weaker than it appears. If the family rallies too aggressively, Patty gets to recast herself as the wounded outsider. In that sense, Patty is not just causing trouble. She is engineering a scenario where every reaction becomes useful to her. And in a city built on reputations, the ability to provoke first and distort later is a terrifying kind of power. Nikki's fury toward Victor grows from a more familiar source, but that does not make it any less explosive. The possibility that Jack's confession about Patty gives Nikki new reason to resent Victor means this is no longer just about one manipulation too many. It is about accumulated rage. Nikki has lived too long beside Victor's ruthless certainty, too long absorbing the emotional cost of his games while being told that everything he does is somehow necessary. There comes a point when power stops looking impressive and starts looking pathetic, and Victor risks reaching that point in her eyes. Nikki's desire for revenge is not adolescent rebellion or wounded pride. It is the response of a woman who has begun to understand that being married to a king often means becoming collateral damage in his wars. If Victor has once again pushed too far, interfered too heavily, or treated other people's emotional lives like chess pieces, Nikki will not want an apology. She will want consequences. What makes this especially compelling is that Nikki does not need to destroy Victor publicly to wound him. She only needs to deny him control. She only needs to support people he expected her to dismiss, or expose motives he expected her to protect. In a household where loyalty has always been weaponized, Nikki quietly stepping outside Victor's line of command becomes a rebellion with real teeth. The more Victor assumes he can ride out her anger, the more likely he is to miss the seriousness of what is forming beneath it. Kyle becomes one of the week's most emotionally vulnerable figures precisely because his pain looks less dramatic on the surface than the chaos around him. Yet the fracture inside him may be even more consequential. Watching his parents' marriage endure pressure from Patty is not simply stressful. It drags him back into the old emotional exhaustion of being an Abbott child raised in a family where love is constantly forced to compete with crisis. Kyle wants stability, but he is surrounded by adults who always seem one revelation away from another implosion. That wears on him. It breeds cynicism, then resentment, then a deeper loneliness he struggles to name. Claire's loyalty to Victor wounds him because it confirms one of his worst fears, that even the people closest to him can still be pulled into the Newman gravitational field, where manipulation is disguised as protection and compromise is sold as wisdom. Kyle does not just feel disappointed. He feels abandoned in advance, as though any future with Claire might already be contaminated by Victor's influence. That is why Audra becomes such a dangerous presence in his orbit. She knows how to reach people at the moment when they are tired of being noble. She knows how to turn emotional fatigue into recklessness. Her teasing may start lightly, but it carries the possibility of something much more combustible because Kyle is not simply attracted to danger. He is exhausted by restraint. Audra's role in Kyle's emotional decline should not be underestimated. She understands the seductive power of being the one person who seems to see someone clearly when everyone else is busy judging, instructing, or disappointing them. If she begins by provoking Kyle, it is because provocation allows her to assess his defenses. Once she sees where the hurt is deepest, she can shift tones and become more sincere, more disarming, more emotionally available than he expected. That is where the true danger lies. Audra is at her most effective not when she is openly manipulative, but when she mixes truth with temptation so skillfully that the other person starts to believe they arrived at the emotional connection on their own. A more genuine bond with Kyle would not need to be fake to be harmful. In fact, the connection would be far more destructive if it were real, because then Kyle would have to confront the possibility that he is drifting towards someone not only because she understands him, but because she appears at a time when his disappointment with Claire has left a door unlocked inside him. Emotional betrayal often begins there, not with grand seduction, but with relief. Kyle is tired of feeling like the reasonable one, while everyone around him plays dangerous games. Audra offers something intoxicating, the freedom to stop pretending he is above those games. Claire becomes trapped in a quieter but deeply painful conflict of her own. Her loyalty to Victor may come from gratitude, family complexity, or a belief that she is handling a difficult relationship with care. But Kyle experiences it as a moral failure. That puts Claire in an impossible position. If she distances herself from Victor, she betrays a family bond that may already feel fragile and recently rebuilt. If she stands by Victor, she risks losing Kyle's trust. What makes this storyline compelling is that Claire's dilemma is not rooted in simple indecision. It is rooted in identity. She is still navigating who she is within this powerful, damaged family system, and people in that position often make choices that are emotionally understandable, but relationally devastating. Claire may convince herself that patience and explanation will be enough, that Kyle will eventually see nuance. But people who are already hurting rarely want nuance. They want proof. If she cannot give that proof, then the emotional distance between them will widen in ways neither of them fully intended. That widening distance is exactly the kind of crack someone like Audra knows how to exploit. Claire's tragedy this week may be that she is not malicious, not careless, and not disloyal in her own mind. Yet she may still lose ground because in moments of emotional crisis, intent matters less than impact. Far away from Genoa City, the Barcelona trip places Tessa and Daniel inside one of the most dangerous emotional environments possible. Beautiful surroundings, shared loneliness, and the false safety of telling themselves that they know where the line is. People often imagine betrayal as a sudden loss of control, but the truth is usually more unsettling. Betrayal grows in carefully rationalized steps. Tessa and Daniel agreeing to travel as friends is precisely the kind of boundary that sounds responsible while quietly making intimacy easier to excuse. Friendship creates permission. It offers cover. It allows two emotionally bruised people to say that closeness is harmless because it is supportive, because it is innocent, because they are both simply trying to survive difficult chapters. But there is nothing simple about this trip. Tessa has already committed herself to repairing things with Mariah, which means every moment of emotional intimacy with Daniel now carries moral weight, whether she wants to admit it or not. Daniel, for his part, is vulnerable in a different but equally dangerous way. He is starved for understanding, angry at the chaos surrounding his family, and deeply susceptible to comfort from someone who feels steady, perceptive, and gentle in the exact ways his world has stopped being. The bond between Tessa and Daniel strengthens not because they are plotting betrayal, but because they are both trying to escape pain without fully acknowledging how self-deceptive that escape has become. Shared travel creates its own little world. In that world, ordinary responsibilities seem distant, unresolved marriages feel briefly suspended, and emotional honesty becomes easier precisely because consequences are not standing in the room yet. That is why their connection can deepen so quickly. Tessa may tell herself that Daniel needs a friend. Daniel may tell himself that he is not taking anything Mariah still has a rightful claim to, but attraction is not always loud. Sometimes, it is a softening, a pause that lingers too long, a moment where two people realize they have become the place each other goes to feel less lonely. The tragedy is that neither of them needs to fully act on it for damage to occur. Emotional infidelity begins with divided allegiance, and that division has already started. The more meaningful their private moments in Barcelona become, the harder it will be for Tessa to return home and honestly say that she never crossed a line. Not every betrayal is physical. Some of the most painful ones are built from attention, emotional dependence, and the quiet decision to give the best parts of one's tenderness to the wrong person. Mariah may not even need proof to sense that something is shifting. In relationships that have already been bruised, intuition can become almost cruelly precise. Tessa's effort to repair the marriage becomes more fragile the moment her emotional energy begins flowing elsewhere. Even if she returns from Barcelona determined to recommit, the emotional residue of the trip could haunt everything that follows. Mariah would likely feel the difference in tone, in guilt, in hesitation, in those tiny moments where someone seems present but not fully reachable. That kind of fracture is hard to argue with because it is felt before it is explained. Tessa's internal struggle then becomes devastating. She may genuinely love Mariah. She may genuinely want to preserve the life they built. But wanting stability is not the same as wanting the person one has promised to choose, and this week threatens to force that distinction into the open. Daniel, meanwhile, risks becoming the man who accepts solace without fully confronting the cost of receiving it. That would make him sympathetic, but not innocent. Emotional need does not erase responsibility. It simply makes responsibility easier to postpone. In London, Billy and Sally move through a very different form of emotional turning point. Their trip carries the promise of possibility, But possibility is always complicated for people like them, because both know what it means to build hope on unstable ground. Billy's potential reconciliation with Jill matters because his conflicts with his mother have long been tied to his identity, his pride, and his recurring need to prove that he can build something without being controlled by the family machinery surrounding him. If London becomes the place where Billy begins repairing that fracture, it could also become the place where he starts imagining a future with Sally that feels more legitimate and less improvised. Yet Billy's hope is never uncomplicated. He is a man haunted by the pattern of his own missteps. Every dream he has ever tried to secure has eventually collided with his impulsiveness, his restlessness, or his inability to resist turning personal emotion into risky action. Sally sees that complexity clearly. That is part of why their bond can feel so compelling. She does not romanticize him blindly. She understands damage, reinvention, and the strange exhaustion that comes with always having to prove you deserve a new beginning. Their conversations about the future, whether they hint at engagement or something less immediate, are emotionally significant because they force both of them to ask whether desire is enough. Sally wants more than chemistry. She wants a future that can survive contact with reality. Billy wants to believe he is finally becoming the version of himself that could sustain such a future. But wanting maturity and embodying it are not the same thing. The danger in London is not obvious scandal. It is premature certainty. If Billy begins painting the future too quickly, Sally may find herself torn between being moved by his sincerity and frightened by how often sincerity in his life has eventually been followed by collapse. This tension gives their storyline real emotional weight. Their romance is not threatened only by outside interference. It is threatened by the history each of them carries inside. For Billy, reconciliation with Jill and commitment to Sally would mean embracing stability instead of chasing escape. That sounds noble, but for people addicted to emotional turbulence, stability can feel strangely intolerable. The true question is not whether Billy loves Sally. It is whether he can live in a future where love requires discipline rather than drama. Phyllis spends this week wrapped in one of the oldest and most painful lies she tells herself, that she is fine because she is still moving. Ambition becomes her anesthesia. Grand plans for Summers are not merely business ideas. They are a shield against humiliation, a way of asserting value when the people whose love she relies on most have stepped back from her. Daniel and Summer turning away cuts more deeply than she wants anyone to know because for all her bravado, Phyllis measures her worth through attachment as much as achievement. Rejection by her children does not just hurt her feelings. It destabilizes her entire emotional center. Yet instead of sitting with that pain, she transforms it into motion. She reaches for strategy, for expansion, for vision. She goes to Lauren because Lauren represents both practical support and an old emotional mirror, someone who can recognize when Phyllis is performing strength instead of truly possessing it. What makes Phyllis fascinating here is that her plans for the future may be partly brilliant and partly delusional at the same time. She often does have strong instincts. The problem is that she tends to pursue them most aggressively when she is emotionally cornered, which means her decisions become contaminated by desperation. There is also something darker brewing beneath Phyllis's determination. Being rejected by Daniel and Summer could push her into a more aggressive need to prove that everyone who doubts her will regret it. That is when ambition becomes vindictive. That is when building something new stops being about hope and starts becoming about retaliation. She may not say it aloud, but some part of Phyllis wants to create a future so undeniable that her children, her critics, and perhaps even the entire town will be forced to see her not as a problem but as a force they underestimated. The tragedy is that this mindset usually pushes her farther away from the very people she wants back. Instead of healing the personal rupture, she risks widening it by becoming more controlling, more obsessive, more unwilling to hear caution from anyone who fears she is overcompensating. Lauren's role, then, becomes delicate. She can support Phyllis without feeding the worst parts of her. But that requires honesty. And honesty is the one thing Phyllis struggles to tolerate when it threatens the image of control she is trying so hard to project. Las Vegas is where the week's psychological tension becomes most overtly dangerous. Matt is on the brink of discovering something that wounds both his pride and his sense of power. If he catches Riza kissing Spider, and if he either already suspects or soon confirms that Spider is Adam, then the betrayal becomes unbearable for reasons that go beyond jealousy. It becomes symbolic. Matt would not just be losing Riza, He would be losing her to a Newman man, to a family synonymous with privilege, manipulation, and the kind of dominance men like Matt cannot stand seeing up close. In that moment, his rage becomes deeply personal and almost ideological. He is no longer just a lover who has been betrayed. He becomes a man convinced he has been humiliated by a system, a dynasty, and a pattern of arrogance he already despises. That is exactly the kind of emotional injury that produces reckless vengeance. Matt's anger does not cool into reason. It hardens into purpose. He begins to think less about pain and more about punishment. Riza's role in that explosion is equally significant, because betrayal is never experienced only by the one being betrayed. The betrayer also has to confront what the betrayal reveals about them. If Riza chooses Adam, even momentarily, she is not just making a romantic decision. She is making a statement about where she believes her future, thrill, or emotional truth lies. That carries consequences. She may tell herself Matt was already too controlling, too volatile, too dangerous to remain loyal to. She may justify the kiss as inevitable, as honest, as the breaking point of something that had already died. But none of those justifications will protect her from what comes next. Matt's fury will not be interested in nuance. To him, this will be a deliberate humiliation, and humiliated men are often most frightening when they can still tell themselves they are the victim. Riza may quickly discover that choosing desire in one moment can trigger an entire chain of violence in the next. That is one of the cruelest patterns in stories like this. A private emotional act becomes the spark for a much wider disaster. Adam's position in Vegas is dangerous because he is never simply a passive participant in chaos. Even when he does not manufacture the entire game, he knows how to move within it. If he is Spider in this environment, then he is already operating behind layers of risk, concealment, and provocation. A kiss with Riza is not just romantic, it is combustible. Adam may tell himself he can handle Matt, outsmart him, or keep one step ahead. That is classic Adam, and it is exactly what makes his confidence so hazardous. He has always been drawn to edge conditions, to the tension between reinvention and self-destruction. But Matt's rage is not the sort of thing Adam can necessarily calculate away. If Adam underestimates how personal this has become, he could pull others into danger before he even realizes the board has changed. The presence of Nick nearby makes the entire situation more volatile, because family history always intensifies conflict. Matt does not just have a grievance against Adam, he now has a grievance that touches the Newman bloodline itself. Nick, however, is the true powder keg of the Vegas storyline, because he is already losing his ability to protect himself. His drug addiction makes him vulnerable in every sense. He is physically weaker, emotionally less stable, and increasingly unable to hide how much control he has lost. What makes Nick's spiral so painful is that it likely remains wrapped in denial. He may still believe he can manage it, still imagine that he only needs time, still insist inwardly that he is not as far gone as others might suspect. But addiction destroys a person's relationship with reality long before it destroys their body. That means Nick is entering a highly dangerous environment already compromised, already reactive, already one crisis away from complete collapse. Matt's revenge, Adam's secrets, and Riza's betrayal form an external storm, but Nick's body is now a storm of its own. The more pressure Vegas applies, the more likely Nick is to make choices that are not simply reckless, but catastrophic. He may misread danger. He may trust the wrong person. He may find himself unable to respond quickly when the situation turns violent. And perhaps most tragically, he may resent anyone who tries to save him, because addiction often transforms rescue into insult. This is where the narrative becomes especially dark. Nick's vulnerability does not merely place him at risk, it makes him useful to the wrong people. In a world of schemes and revenge, the weakest person in the room often becomes the most exploitable. Matt could see Nick as leverage against Adam or the Newmans. Adam could see Nick as someone he needs to shield, thereby dividing his own attention at the worst possible time. Nick himself could become so desperate for relief that he compromises his judgment in ways that hand power directly to the enemy. A worsening addiction storyline works best when it is not isolated from external conflict, and here, that conflict sharpens everything. Nick is not self-destructing in private. He is unraveling in the middle of a power struggle, which means his illness becomes part of the strategy whether anyone intends it or not. That is brutal, but it is dramatically honest. People rarely implode in ideal conditions. They implode while the world is still demanding that they perform strength. Back in Genoa City, the return of Malcolm Winters introduces another layer of emotional tension because Malcolm has always carried the kind of presence that can stir memory, unfinished feeling, and uncomfortable truth all at once. His return suggests that old emotional currents within the Winters orbit may begin moving again, especially at a moment when other families are also being forced to confront what they have buried. Malcolm is the kind of character whose reappearance can reset the tone of a room without much effort. He brings with him history, perspective, and the possibility that others may no longer be able to keep their narratives neatly arranged. If he steps back into ongoing tensions, he may become either a stabilizing figure or an emotional disruptor, depending on what truths he chooses to touch. The timing matters. In a week already full of fractured trust and temptation, any returning figure with emotional history instantly becomes a catalyst. The reappearance of Dr. Stephanie Simmons suggests that some of the emotional chaos ahead may be matched by medical or psychological urgency. In a week where addiction worsens, stress compounds, and people make increasingly dangerous choices, a doctor's return does not feel incidental, it feels ominous. Stephanie's presence could intersect with the fallout of Nick's condition, with broader emotional crises, or with the kind of professional insight that threatens to strip away denial. That matters because denial is the fuel of so many of these storylines. Jack denies how deeply his choices have destabilized trust. Tessa denies the full moral danger of emotional intimacy with Daniel. Billy denies how fragile his hope can become when pressed too quickly into promises. Phyllis denies how broken she feels beneath her ambition. Nick denies the scale of his addiction. A doctor returning in the midst of all this carries symbolic weight. It suggests that the body, the mind, and the truth may soon become impossible to separate. What makes this entire week so compelling is the way every storyline circles the same emotional question from a different angle. What do people do when the version of themselves they want to believe in begins collapsing under pressure? Jack wants to be the protector who can still restore order through honesty. Diane wants to be the wife whose place cannot be shaken by a ghost from the past. Patty wants to be the one person whose claim on Jack still matters. Nikki wants to believe she can love Victor without being consumed by what loving him costs. Kyle wants to be loyal without feeling foolish. Claire wants to balance family and romance without losing either. Audra wants connection without surrendering her instinct for power. Tessa wants comfort without naming it betrayal. Daniel wants closeness without facing the moral implications. Billy wants a future that does not repeat his worst patterns. Sally wants love that does not become another trap. Phyllis wants reinvention without admitting how much rejection has wounded her. Matt wants revenge that feels like justice. Riza wants freedom without blood on the choice. Adam wants control in a situation already slipping. Nick wants escape from pain without recognizing he is becoming pain to himself. Malcolm and Stephanie return to a landscape where everyone is one hard truth away from collapse. And that is why this week should not be seen as a collection of separate events, but as one sustained emotional siege. Secrets do not simply come out. They change the balance of power. Temptation does not merely test love. It reveals which promises were already weakening from within. Trouble does not just erupt around unstable men in places like Vegas. It hunts the fault lines that have been there all along. The strongest material in a story like this always comes from watching characters convince themselves they still have time to correct course when, in reality, they are already making the very choices that will define their downfall. That is the cruel beauty of the week ahead. Nearly everyone still has a chance to pull back, to confess sooner, to set a boundary, to choose honesty, to accept help, to stop treating emotional hunger like a harmless impulse. But that is not usually how people behave when wounded pride, unresolved history, and loneliness are all operating at once. They lean closer to the fire. They call it survival. They call it passion. They call it destiny. Then they act shocked when everything burns. By the end of these days, the biggest damage may not come from any single exposed secret or overt betrayal. It may come from the quieter realization that many of these characters were already standing at the edge, and all this week did was remove the comforting illusion that they were still safe. Genoa City thrives on glamour, legacy, and the endless promise that powerful people can always recover. But weeks like this challenge that promise. They ask whether recovery is still possible once pride turns to vengeance, once emotional support turns to temptation, once family loyalty becomes another name for manipulation, and once pain is numbed so long that a person can no longer tell the difference between control and collapse. That is why the coming episodes feel so volatile. They are not simply about what happens next. They are about who these people become when the masks finally crack.